Hi everyone, and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. I'm really happy you're here. Tonight, we're going to go on a calm and quiet trip to learn something amazing. So get comfy, take a deep breath, and let's enjoy this peaceful science story together. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? If you like relaxing science videos, don't forget to tap the like button. Now let's begin.
Beneath the silence of winter's breath, where light bends low and shadows soften into snow, something ancient stirs. In the white stillness of the Arctic, the forest once exhaled gently, drawing carbon from the air and tucking it into trunks and roots deep into the cool earth. These northern trees, slow to speak and slower to grow, were once quiet keepers of the planet's breath, pulling in what we exhale, locking it in their wooden bones. But now, the breath beneath the snow is changing. The Arctic, once a realm where cold ruled without question, is warming faster than almost any other place on Earth. Winters grow shorter, summers stretch longer, and the old balance begins to tremble. What was once a carbon sink, a net absorber of carbon dioxide, has started to let go. The forests, which once held their breath for centuries, are beginning to exhale. In the soft crunch of snow under moose hooves, in the whisper of pine needles heavy with frost, the change is slow but certain. Warming soil awakens ancient microbes once held still by ice. These microbes are tiny, but their hunger is vast. As they stir from their frozen sleep, they begin to feast not on new leaves, but on old roots, decaying leaves, and carbon stored for thousands of years in frozen soil. And as they feed, they breathe out carbon dioxide and methane into the crisp Arctic air. You can almost feel it, the breath of the forest reversing. It's not loud, it's not violent, but it's there, steady and slow, like the turning of a tide beneath moonlight. These boreal forests, stretching from Alaska to Siberia, were long thought to be peaceful guardians of the Earth's climate. Now they teeter on the edge of a quiet transformation. In the warm months, trees still grow. They still draw in sunlight and carbon. They still whisper through photosynthesis, turning air into life. But the warming soil below tells another story. What the trees store above, the Earth releases from below. And slowly the scales tip. Year after year, the balance shifts. What once absorbed now emits. Some scientists walk across the permafrost with instruments and quiet worry. They measure gases rising from moss and melting peat. They kneel beside lichen patches and press their fingers to the ground, not to feel warmth but to feel loss. A loss of stillness, a loss of frozen time. In those buried layers of soil lie centuries of carbon, stored when mammoths still roamed and snow fell deeper. As the ice melts, so too does the memory of cold. And with it, the stored breath of ages past is released into the sky. Let's drift deeper where the soil tells a story written in layers. Just below the moss lies a thin layer called the active zone, where freeze meets thaw, where microbes wake each summer, do their quiet work, then sleep again when frost returns. Beneath that, the permafrost. Hard, cold, ancient, or it was. Permafrost means permanently frozen, but in many places that name no longer holds true. As the Arctic warms, that line between thawed and frozen sinks further down. More old carbon becomes exposed. More life, once paused in time, begins to move again. The forests above change too. Fires come more often, sparked by dry heat and wind. In the past, fire was part of the boreal rhythm, cleansing, renewing, but now the rhythm stumbles. Fires rage hotter. They scorch not only trees but the soil itself. In some places, the flames melt the permafrost directly, pulling more carbon from the earth like steam from a cup. And after the fire passes, blackened land releases even more greenhouse gases into the sky. And still there is silence. The trees do not scream, the soil does not shout. Change comes softly here, wrapped in snowflakes, carried on the breath of wind through trembling branches. But if you listen closely, if you stand still in that white hush, you might feel it, the forest breathing out ever so gently. Once the Arctic forests were like a sleeping bear, steady and calm, keeping warmth inside as the world rushed on. Now that bear stirs, not in anger, not in haste, but in response to a world that no longer holds its cold. In the stillness of twilight, when the sky blushes faintly pink and the air smells of pine and distant smoke, a moose moves between trees. Its breath rises in soft clouds. Somewhere beneath its hooves, the soil exhales a little more carbon. Above, the trees stretch their limbs toward the light, still doing their quiet work. But they are not enough now. The balance has shifted. This is not a story of doom. It is a story of breath. How forests inhale, how soil exhales, how even the coldest places are not immune to the warmth of change. It is a story told slowly, like wind carving snowdrifts, like lichens growing inch by inch over stone. It is not finished. The breath continues. It shifts and sways, uncertain. And yet the question remains, can the Arctic forest remember how to hold its breath again? Let's drift deeper now, beneath the frost-touched needles and into the soil that never forgets. Each handful of Arctic ground holds a memory, not the kind we write in books or speak aloud, but the kind that lingers, slow and quiet, in carbon and time. For thousands of years, the permafrost has been Earth's great diary of cold, a frozen vault holding remnants of forests, of ancient fires, of long-dead roots and moss that once brushed the sun. Now that vault is cracking open. When the sun returns after a long polar night, it doesn't just warm the trees, it stirs the ground. The top layer softens. Bacteria, once frozen in place, begin to flutter awake. These tiny beings, invisible to the eye, are the new scribes of the Arctic. They read the old pages of the soil and slowly erase them, turning ancient carbon into breath, into gas, into sky. And in this quiet undoing, something profound unfolds. The past is being released into the present. The process is gentle, like mist rising off a thawed pond, but it is constant. As permafrost thaws, it exposes more of what was hidden: layers of peat, woody debris, frozen roots that once drank from glacial streams. Some of this material is thousands of years old, but in the hands or mouths of microbes, it is fresh fuel. Through respiration, these organisms release carbon dioxide and methane, the latter being more than 25 times more potent as a greenhouse gas. It's a cycle that once held balance. In summer, plants captured carbon from the air. In winter, everything slept. But now the ground doesn't sleep as long, and the awakenings grow deeper. As more permafrost thaws, more microbes awaken, and with each breath they take, the sky gains more of Earth's forgotten carbon. There's a word scientists use for this unraveling: positive feedback, but it feels more like a spiral. Warming causes thawing. Thawing releases gases. Those gases cause more warming. And around the Arctic turns, not in circles of snow, but in cycles of release. Somewhere in Siberia, a black spruce leans ever so slightly, its roots loosened by melting ground. This phenomenon, called thermokarst, forms when ice in the soil melts and the land above sinks or slumps. Trees begin to tilt, lakes appear where none were, hills sag and new wetlands form. From the sky, the Arctic starts to look as if it's melting from within, reshaping itself like wax near a flame. And yet, amid all this change, life continues. Arctic foxes still weave through the trees, their paws whispering against soft moss. Owls still perch silently on branches, their eyes like moons in the pale sun. Life doesn't stop. It adapts, but its rhythm changes, tuned now to a different tempo, a warmer beat. The science behind this is as beautiful as it is haunting. Satellite images show subtle changes year by year: darker patches where snow once lingered, earlier thaws, deeper active layers. Instruments buried in the soil capture carbon fluxes like breath patterns of the earth. You can see the land inhale during summer growth and exhale in late autumn, in winter warm spells after fire. Each breath is measured, studied, weighed. And slowly the pattern becomes clear. The exhale grows stronger. Researchers build towers in the tundra, silent watchers that rise above the spruce and birch. These eddy covariance towers capture the delicate dance of gases in the air. They don't speak, but they reveal. And what they tell us is this: the boreal forest, once neutral or even a slight carbon sink, has begun to give more than it receives. It now contributes to the atmosphere it once helped calm. Yet even in this, there is wonder. Because the Arctic is not a place of simple endings. It is a mosaic of responses. In some areas, warmer temperatures lead to more growth, longer growing seasons, taller shrubs, even new species moving northward. In others, fire and thaw outpace growth and the carbon loss outweighs the gain. There is no single story here, only threads weaving through time, soil, fire, and breath. And so, scientists walk softly across this patchwork. They bring not only their tools, but their questions, their awe, their humility. They do not shout into the forest. They listen, for the land speaks in changes, not in words. Imagine standing in such a place, where the air is thin and sharp with cold, but the ground beneath your boots is warmer than it should be, where frost heaves lift stones like breath beneath skin, where old mammoth bones emerge from melting banks, their surfaces smooth from the cold, their histories seeping into the air as microbes feast on once frozen cells. This is not fiction. It is science unfolding slowly, one molecule at a time, a truth carried on currents of wind, buried in thawing loam. And in the middle of it all stands the tree, the silent keeper of seasons. It still stretches toward the light, still turns sunlight into sugar, still drops its needles in quiet ceremony each fall. But it now stands on shifting ground. Its roots, once firm in frozen earth, now tremble slightly with the movement beneath. Still it remains, a sentinel, a witness. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers a time when the cold never left, when snow came early and stayed late, when the breath beneath it moved slowly, held in pause, cradled by the frost. We walk now in a moment between memory and change, between what was and what could still be. The Arctic is not yet lost, its forests are not yet broken, but they are different. Their breath is longer, warmer, more uncertain. And if we listen with care, we might learn what they are trying to tell us, not in warnings, but in whispers, not in despair, but in deep, old knowledge passed down through roots and frozen time. Now let us drift toward stillness, toward the soft hush of understanding, where science and story fold gently into one another. The Arctic forest, this vast and ancient ocean of trees, continues to breathe, but the rhythm has changed. Its breath once drew carbon deep into the ground, quietly storing the sky within its roots. Now that breath returns upward, slow and full of memory, exhaling what was once hidden. But even as the ground thaws and the gases rise, there is something more here than loss. There is resilience, not in the way we often imagine, loud or heroic, but quiet and deeply woven. The boreal forest is not giving up, it is transforming, adapting inch by inch, breath by breath, to a world it did not choose. Spruce and pine may still whisper in the wind, but so do willow and birch, creeping northward, filling in spaces that used to stay frozen. Grasses appear where moss once blanketed the land. Lichens fade and shrubs bloom in their place. Where ice retreats, water pools. Tiny wetlands appear, catching light like scattered mirrors. These new habitats invite change. Insects shift their timing, birds arrive earlier. The red fox follows the warming trail north, chasing the Arctic fox from its frozen home. In every corner of this forest, life adjusts, bends, finds another way. And while some species struggle, others bloom into the warmth, painting new colors into the Arctic's breath. Scientists return, year after year, drawn by this tension of loss and adaptation. They kneel beside sagging ground, they measure the slope of tilting trees, they listen to the bubbling of methane from once frozen lakes. They carry instruments, but they also carry hope, because every question answered reveals another. Every change observed reminds us that this story is still being written. The Arctic is not finished speaking. It tells us not only about the North, but about ourselves. The way we live, the fuels we burn, the forests we protect or forget, these choices ride on the wind, rising from cities and oceans, reaching even the silent woods of the Arctic. We are, without ever setting foot there, breathing into its story, and now it breathes back. In some places, communities that have lived with the Arctic for generations feel these changes in their bones. Hunters find caribou paths altered, fish behave differently beneath thinning ice, berries ripen too early or too late. The wisdom of elders, once tuned perfectly to the timing of the land, must now stretch to hold new truths. Still, they listen. Still, they adapt. And perhaps we too must learn to listen, not only with our minds, but with a quieter part of ourselves. The part that understands rhythm. The part that remembers what it's like to wait for snow, to feel the hush of winter cover everything, to marvel at a single flake landing gently on skin. Because the breath of the Arctic is not just data. It is not only charts and gases and graphs. It is a lullaby in the language of ice, a whisper in the voice of wind, a reflection of a world connected in invisible threads. What the Arctic releases does not stay in the north. It joins the great swirling sky, adding to the warmth that touches every shore, every forest, every breath we take. Still, we are not powerless. If the soil has memory, so do we. We can remember the balance and find new ways to live gently, to reduce the fires we ignite and the fuels we burn. We can tend to forests not just as resources, but as lungs, as storytellers, as ancient companions who have always held our air in their green fingers. And we can choose to believe, not in stopping time, but in changing course. There are already efforts to protect permafrost, to reduce emissions, to understand the delicate ways ecosystems respond. Reforestation, soil protection, fire management, each step is a thread we can pull to help slow the unraveling. But more than that, we must return to a kind of attention, the kind that listens to what the land is saying, the kind that walks softly, speaks quietly, and lets science become something intimate, not distant, not clinical, but close as breath. Because when you think of the Arctic forest now, it is not enough to picture only trees. You must picture time, picture memory, picture the quiet hum of microbes. Beneath your feet, the crackling thaw of soil remembering warmth, the exhale of ancient roots long after the tree is gone. And then picture possibility. The forest has changed, yes, but change does not mean ending, it means becoming. The Arctic, like the Earth itself, is always becoming, not the same as before, but not lost. A new rhythm is forming, a new breath, and within that, a chance for us to choose how we listen, how we respond, how we walk forward. In the final light of day, when the sun hovers low over the snowy horizon, the trees cast long shadows across the ground. You can almost see their breath rising, not steam, not smoke, but something older, something invisible and real, the breath beneath the snow, still moving, still speaking, still waiting to be heard. There is a kind of silence that only ice can hold, a silence layered deep in ancient glaciers, in frozen bogs, in the still breath of Arctic lakes. This silence has waited for millennia, carrying the weight of time and memory like pages pressed between stone, but even in the heart of such cold stillness there are memories of heat, because the ice remembers fire. The Arctic is often imagined as a world beyond flame, a realm ruled by snow and frost where nothing burns, only freezes, but this is not the full truth. Beneath the whiteness in the roots of black spruce and the dry grasses of the tundra, fire has always had a place. It is not a stranger to the north, only a quiet visitor. In the past, fire would come like a whisper, a slow, smoldering burn through old needles and peat, cleansing the forest floor and making room for new life. But now, the whispers grow louder. As the earth warms, fire finds more to feed on. Summers stretch longer and dry winds sweep across the boreal lands. Lightning strikes more frequently. And where once the dampness of snow and moss held flames at bay, now the land is thirsty. Trees that once stood strong against the cold now tremble under the heat. Fires burn deeper, hotter, longer. Imagine walking through a forest not yet touched by flame, but dry and brittle with anticipation. The moss is soft beneath your feet, but no longer cool. The air holds the weight of stillness, the kind that comes just before something breaks. Above, the canopy of spruce and larch filters the light, golden and quiet. Below, the forest floor waits. And when fire comes, it does not come as a gentle guest. It races, it leaps. It dances across treetops and dives into the soil. In some places, the fire reaches down into the very bones of the earth, into the peat, into the permafrost, into the carbon-rich soil that has not known warmth in thousands of years. There, the ice begins to melt, and with the melt, more carbon is released. The fire does not just consume the present, it awakens the past. This is what scientists call a feedback loop, but to the forest, it is more like a chain of sighs. Fire warms the soil thaws and releases carbon. That carbon rises, warming the air. The warmer air brings more fire. Around and around it goes, each breath a little heavier than the last. In Alaska, in Siberia, in the Canadian North, wildfires now reach into places they never touched before. They burn through ancient forests. They leave scars on the land, black and wide. But they do not only scorch the surface, they go deeper. In some places, the fire burns underground for months, even through winter, smoldering quietly beneath the snow. These are called zombie fires, fires that never truly die, fires that wait. And the ice remembers each one. When permafrost burns, it is not just a matter of trees and smoke. It is a matter of stored time. Trapped within frozen ground are remnants of entire worlds, old plants, long-buried animals, forgotten forests. As fire reaches into these layers, it releases not only carbon dioxide but methane, a gas far more potent. What was once locked away by cold is now set free by heat. And so the fire becomes a kind of storyteller, though it does not use words. It tells us in smoke and gas that change is here. Yet even as fire takes, it also reveals. After the burn, the land is bare, but in the blackened soil, seeds stir. Some trees, like the jack pine, need fire to open their cones. Heat cracks them open, letting life escape into the ash. Certain mushrooms bloom only in charred earth. Fireweed rises in pink waves across scorched fields. Ravens return first, flying low over the new emptiness, their calls echoing through the trees. Still, something is different now. The intervals between fires shrink. Forests do not have time to recover before the next flame arrives. The old cycle is speeding up and the land does not know this rhythm. Regrowth stumbles. Young trees fail to take root. The ground, once anchored by roots and moss, becomes loose, vulnerable to erosion, collapse. From the air, burned patches look like puzzle pieces, blackened wounds in a sea of green, but each piece tells a story of heat, of smoke, of the ice beneath, remembering what fire felt like. And the memory spreads. Fires in the Arctic do not stay in the Arctic. The smoke rises, travels across continents, circles the globe. It dims the sky. It adds to the warming. It carries the scent of burning tundra into places that have never seen snow. In this way, the Arctic speaks to all of us, even those far from its borders. But still, the forest does not give up. In the quiet that follows the burn, life begins again. Slowly, tenderly, charred soil cools. Lichen creeps back. Shoots push upward through the ash. And even though the permafrost below may be weakened, even though the carbon may have escaped, the land continues to try. Some scientists believe there is still time, that with care and understanding, fire can be part of healing, that if we reduce the fuels we add to the air, if we protect these northern lands, manage their forests gently, and listen to their rhythms, we can slow the cycle. Not stop it, but slow it, enough for the ice to hold a little longer, enough for the fire to burn softer. And in that slowing there is hope. Because the memory of fire is not only destruction, it is also rebirth. The Arctic knows this, the trees know this, the soil, even as it thaws, remembers what it is to grow again. So when the firelight fades and the snow begins to fall once more, the ice listens. It does not forget what the flames brought, but it waits patient, ancient, for the breath of green to return. Let's drift further now into the places where the fire has passed but its echo remains. In the Arctic, scars are slow to fade. Long after the flames vanish into memory, the ground carries the story. A blackened log half buried in snow, a melted patch of permafrost that never quite froze again, a sapling that tries to rise but finds the soil too warm, too unstable. The ice remembers not just the moment of burning, but the long, quiet aftermath. To understand what fire means here, we must look not just at the trees, but beneath them. The Arctic soul lies in its soil, built over thousands of years, rich with carbon, frozen like glass beneath the roots. In colder centuries, this layer stayed sealed, locking away what the air once gave. Every fallen leaf, every bit of moss, every whisper of ancient grass was tucked in and preserved, forming thick peatlands and frozen loam, a library of the earth's breath. But fire breaks the seal. When wildfire sweeps across boreal forests, it does not stop at the needles. It moves down into the very skin of the earth. Flames lick the moss away, exposing peat. Then the peat smolders, slow, persistent, consuming what was once held in deep time. Beneath the peat lies permafrost, a frozen keeper of vast carbon stores. When fire warms the surface long enough, the permafrost softens, sinks, and surrenders. What follows is not just release, but transformation. Scientists call these shifts thermokarst landscapes, where one solid ground begins to move, like butter warming on a stone. Hillsides collapse, lakes form where forests once stood. The land becomes patchwork, stitched with water and exposed earth. It's a kind of breathing, but more erratic now, more burdened. The ground exhales carbon not as a gentle rhythm, but as a gasp. And yet it is not just about carbon. When ice gives way to fire, entire ecosystems shift. Roots that held soil in place can no longer grip. Nutrients once stored neatly in frozen chambers now spill into streams. Rivers darken, lakes bloom with algae, insects arrive out of season. Salmon paths shift. Moose and bear follow new scents across unfamiliar ground. In a forest shaped by fire, memory is not linear. Some places recover, some do not. Some trees return taller, others never rise again. The delicate balance depends on many things: the depth of burn, the timing of the thaw, the richness of the seedbed, the presence of life just waiting for a clearing. But now the speed of change outpaces recovery. Fire comes before roots can return, before shade cools the soil, before moss can wrap itself around the earth and say, rest. And so the Arctic enters a kind of uncertain becoming, no longer frozen, not yet stable, not the tundra it was, and not the forest it hopes to be. This in-between world hums with tension, an orchestra tuning itself while the stage crumbles beneath. Still, there is science in the silence. Researchers return to burned sites not just to observe what is gone, but to learn what might still be possible. They measure heat flow deep into the ground. They trace methane bubbling from collapsed thermokarst pits. They count seedlings, monitor saplings, and map fire scars from the sky. Some even fly drones over the shifting terrain, watching how the land breathes, how it swells and sinks as it remembers fire. They have found that certain species now move north faster than expected. Trees like alder and birch, quick to take advantage of disturbance, spread into places once held in winter's grip. Their roots loosen the soil, their leaves add warmth to the forest floor. In their wake come insects and birds that once belonged to temperate zones. The Arctic is not just thawing, it is blending. This mix of cold and warmth, old and new, creates strange pockets of time. You might walk through a field of fresh fireweed, bright pink against black ash, and suddenly step onto a patch of ancient lichen untouched by flame. In one direction, the world smells of new green. In another, of smoke and memory. And beneath it all, the ground shifts quietly, always releasing something once forgotten. But with this shift comes danger. The more the Arctic changes, the more vulnerable it becomes. Fire does not just return, it evolves. New fuels appear, old protections vanish, and some fires no longer need lightning. In places where oil and gas infrastructure touches the tundra, where human settlements encroach on the edge of wilderness, sparks arise from machines, from roads, from heat itself. What begins as one flame can spread across thousands of hectares, consuming not only trees but soil and all the quiet breath beneath. And the climate listens. Each fire adds more warmth to the air. Each warming year brings more fire. The loop tightens. A cycle once stretched over centuries now spins over decades. The Arctic, once seen as distant, becomes central, a powerful driver of global change. Yet even now, in this era of thawing and burning, there is room for awe. Because the land is not silent in its transformation. It hums, it calls. It reminds us of what it means to hold memory in place. And perhaps it also teaches us what happens when that memory is released. The lesson is not just in carbon or fire, but in time, in the way a place can carry thousands of years in silence, only to speak them all in a single breath of smoke. To walk through a post-fire Arctic forest is to walk through an ending and a beginning at once. The charcoal crunches underfoot, but in the ash tiny green things reach for light. The sun feels warmer, the wind smells richer, the soil steams softly in the morning cold. And maybe, just maybe, the land will find a new rhythm, not the one it knew, but one that allows for both memory and change. This is what the ice remembers, and what we must learn to hear. Now let us move gently toward closure, where fire, ice, and breath dissolve into one last unfolding. Imagine standing in the twilight of a burnt forest, where silence is no longer emptiness, but the space left for listening. Charcoal clings to the bark of trees like shadows that will never wash away. The earth is soft and warm beneath your feet, damp from recent snowmelt, yet warmer than it should be. Steam curls from the ground, whispering upward, carrying stories once frozen in the soil. This is where fire and ice meet, not in war but in quiet remembrance. The Arctic does not burn like other forests. It does not crackle and roar with dramatic fury. Its fires move slower, deeper, lingering not only in the trees but in the very crust of the land. And long after the flames have left, the thaw continues. The breath of the ground is longer now, slower, changed. In this changed breath, scientists continue to listen. Some monitor satellite readings, watching as black scars stretch further across green landscapes. Others press glass vials into warm soil, collecting gases that drift upward: methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. Each molecule is a word. Each rise in concentration is a sentence. Together, they tell the story of a world remembering warmth too quickly. These gases, especially methane, are not new. They are ancient, trapped in permafrost since before cities rose or machines hummed. When released, they move silently into the sky, weaving into clouds, joining the great, swirling system of Earth's air. And from there, they reflect heat back to the ground, not as a punishment, but as a response. The Arctic releases and the world receives. But not all the change is invisible. In burned landscapes, strange beauty arises. Charred trees stand like sculptures. Between them, fireweed glows with impossible color, bright magenta in a world of gray. New grass pushes through ash. Willow saplings sprout where moss once lay. Even birds return, cautious at first, then full of song. These are not signs of healing in the old sense, but of becoming. A new Arctic, not as we knew it, but as it is now becoming. Still, even in becoming, there are boundaries. Some species will not return, some soils will not refreeze. Some fires will smolder through winter and rise again in spring. In the Yukon, they've found hotspots still burning months after snow fell. In Siberia, entire forests vanish into flames fed by dried peat that once lay safely frozen. The old map of the Arctic, its cycles, its seasons, its certainties, has begun to blur. And yet the Arctic teaches not despair but perspective. It reminds us that time is not a SDR. A height path but a river that meanders, pools, and sometimes reverses. Just as ice can remember fire, we too can remember what it means to live in balance, to observe before we act, to care for what we do not fully understand. Because the fire in the end is not the enemy, it is a message, a mirror, a voice saying the earth is alive, it breathes, it changes, and it remembers. The ice does not resist fire with anger, it meets it with memory. What we do now becomes the next layer, the next archive of air and ash. This understanding brings us to a quieter kind of hope. Not the hope of erasing damage, but of shaping response, of adapting our own rhythms to match the Earth's, slower, more attuned, more respectful. It is not too late to act, not too late to change the fuels we burn, the lands we protect, the ways we speak of the Arctic not as distant, but as deeply connected to us all. There are people who have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, indigenous communities who know the timing of berries and the breath of rivers. Their stories, passed down in spoken word and silent practice, carry more than folklore. They carry data, wisdom, rhythm. As scientists measure and satellites scan, these stories offer something else: context, meaning, a reminder that not all knowledge is written, some is felt. Some is remembered in the way reindeer move across burned land, or how snow forms differently after fire warms the ground. These communities adapt too. They shift their hunts, they rebuild, they teach the young what the elders knew and also what no elder has ever seen. In their resilience, there is a message for us: change is not the end of story, but its middle. And the earth, even as it warms, continues to offer chances for us to listen, to protect peatlands before they dry, to manage forests with humility, to reduce the heat we send into the air. Each choice, however small, feeds the larger breath. So when the fire comes again, and it will, the hope is that it meets land prepared not just by science but by care, land that still holds some of its coolness, that still remembers the rhythm of frost returning, that still has time to breathe slowly. In the end, the story of fire and ice is not a tale of one winning over the other. It is the story of balance shifting, of breath changing, of life finding new shapes in the wake of heat. The Arctic is becoming something new, and in its transformation, it invites us to choose what kind of warmth we bring. As the final snow begins to fall again over a charred ridge, the ash cools. A new silence settles in, not of ending but of rest. The ground, warm and breathing, waits. Above it, stars shimmer in the clean sky. The ice, though thinner, listens still. And somewhere far below, a root curls into blackened soil and begins again. There was a time when the forest knew exactly when to rest. It followed the stars and the slant of sunlight, the chill in the wind and the lengthening shadow of each afternoon. As autumn deepened, the trees would slow their breath. Leaves would fall in soft spirals. Sap would draw downward, deep into roots. The forest would sleep, wrapped in frost beneath a quilt of snow. Everything waited, everything paused. But now, something is stirring where stillness once ruled. Across the Arctic and boreal regions, the rhythm of rest is beginning to falter. Winters come later, they leave earlier. The nights are still long but not as cold. The forest, once guided by a clock written in ice and moonlight, now struggles to find its place. Some trees hold their leaves too long. Some shrubs awaken before the frost has finished speaking. The quiet cycle of sleep is disrupted, and in its place, a kind of restless waking begins. At the heart of this change is a phenomenon both subtle and immense: global warming reshaping seasonal cues. The Arctic is warming nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the world. This change seeps into every layer of the forest's being. It alters how roots grow, how leaves unfurl, how animals move, and how the trees themselves keep time. Dormancy, the deep winter sleep that once protected plants from cold and drought, is no longer guaranteed. In these woods where snow once fell in thick, steady waves, rain now sometimes takes its place. Instead of insulating snowpack, thin ice crusts the ground. Beneath it, roots remain too warm, microbes stay awake, and decomposition continues where it should have paused. The forest, without true sleep, begins to forget how to rest. This forgetting carries consequences. When trees do not enter full dormancy, they burn more energy through the winter. Their internal systems, designed for pause, now remain in a low hum of activity. This makes them vulnerable. A sudden cold snap, once expected, now erratic, can catch them off guard. Without the protective hardening that true dormancy provides, cells burst. Branches die back. Some trees fail to leaf out in spring. The soil feels this too. The past, snow protected it like a blanket. Under that cover, the topsoil remained steady, even in deep cold. Now, with less snow and more freeze-thaw cycles, the soil cracks open. Fungi and bacteria, once kept in quiet slumber, remain active longer. They process organic matter faster. They exhale more carbon into the air. The ground breathes out, even as the forest above forgets to breathe in. You can almost sense it when you walk among the trees. The stillness has changed. It is thinner, less certain. Moss feels damp when it should be brittle. Buds swell early, only to freeze. Insects appear before the birds that once fed on them. Songbirds, guided by light, return too late for the feast. And in the canopy, the rhythm is off. Spring comes, but not with the harmony it once held. In this new rhythm, fire creeps in. Without deep snow to hold moisture in the land, spring begins dry. Trees, weakened from sleepless winters, become fuel. Fires start earlier, burn faster, and spread into areas once protected by cold. Where the forest should be waking gently, it finds itself already aflame. And so the cycle turns again, disrupted rest leading to vulnerability, vulnerability feeding heat, heat rushing growth out of sync. And yet not everything is suffering. Some species adapt. Certain shrubs, long held back by snowpack, now thrive. Grasses spread. Evergreen trees, slow to respond, begin to lose space to more opportunistic species. In this quiet reshaping, the very identity of the forest begins to change. What was once spruce and larch may become alder and birch. What was once moss-covered ground may become grassland, then shrubland, then something new. Scientists trace these changes with careful hands. They measure the length of growing seasons, count budburst days, map fire scars, and compare satellite images year after year. They find that the boreal forest now grows longer into the autumn and awakens sooner in spring. In some places, the active season is nearly a month longer than it was just decades ago. The forest doesn't sleep as it used to. Some parts hardly sleep at all. But this extended wakefulness does not mean more growth. Often, it means more stress. Trees must balance light, water, and temperature. When one arrives without the others, when sun comes before thaw or melt comes without deep freeze, the balance fails. Photosynthesis slows, growth weakens. The forest, though awake, is tired. Imagine the weariness of a forest that cannot sleep. Not just trees, but every thread of life woven into them. The animals that depend on buds appearing at the right moment. The fungi that fruit in sync with decay. The insects whose cycles match the warming of soil. These symphonies are precise, honed by millennia, but now the instruments play out of time, and the silence between notes grows longer. Even the trees' internal clocks begin to lose their bearings. They rely on cues like temperature, day length, and soil moisture to begin dormancy. But when those signals clash, when the day is short but the air still warm, they do not know how to respond. Some trees delay their preparations. Others begin too early. Either way, they risk losing their rhythm. And once the rhythm is lost, recovery becomes harder with each passing year. There is a word for this in ecological research: phenological mismatch, a disconnect between life's timing and the environment it depends on. It happens quietly without alarm, but it reshapes everything. Pollinators miss flowers, birds miss insects, roots miss water. The forest, forgetting sleep, forgets its own memory. Still, the Arctic does not surrender. There is resilience in its bones. Some species hold on with quiet tenacity. Lichens cling to rock. Aspen groves send up shoots from scorched earth. Under the snow that still falls, even if briefly, seeds wait. Not every cycle is broken. Not every rhythm is gone. But the lullaby that once carried the forest into rest is harder to hear, and harder still to follow. In this place where the stars shine longest, and the cold once taught everything how to wait, the forest now leans forward, uncertain. Its rest is lighter. Its breath is uneven. And its dream of winter, once deep and steady, is now filled with interruption. Let's walk deeper now into this restless forest, where the old songs of winter are growing quiet and the trees stand in a kind of waking confusion. The boreal lands were once shaped by certainty. Cold would arrive always, and the rhythm of life would bow to it. Trees would harden, soil would seal, streams would hush under thick layers of ice. In this slowness there was safety. The cold was not an enemy, but a teacher, reminding all life to rest, to pause, to wait. But the forest is forgetting those lessons. Longer growing seasons stretch the pulse of life, but not always in harmony. Instead of easing into slumber, many species now hover between sleep and wakefulness, caught in a light that stays too long and a kai. That never fully settles. This state, neither fully active nor fully dormant, is a kind of ecological fatigue, and it leaves the forest more vulnerable with each passing year. Deciduous trees like birch and poplar once turned gold with graceful timing, letting go of their leaves in gentle cascades before the first frost. But now the signals come late or arrive in fragments. Some trees hold their leaves too long, only to be hit by unexpected snow or ice. Others drop them too soon before they've drawn in enough energy from the sun. These mistimed moments chip away at their strength, season after season, like a clock slowly losing its hands. The needles of evergreens, too, are affected. Their protective waxes, meant to thicken in anticipation of cold, don't form as reliably when temperatures stay mild. This means more desiccation, drying out during unexpected freezes. Their roots, still active beneath shallow snow, continue to search for water that is locked away in frostless but still dry soil. The trees keep reaching, even when there is little left to find. This low-level stress echoes through the whole forest. Trees weakened by inconsistent dormancy become more susceptible to disease. Bark beetles, for instance, are thriving in places they once couldn't survive. Warmer winters allow them to multiply faster, attack earlier, and penetrate deeper into the forest. In the past, a long, hard freeze would have held them back. Now the beetles stay awake too. And so the forest enters a loop of exhaustion. Warm winters prevent full rest. Without rest, trees weaken. Weakened trees invite pests. Pests spread faster in warm conditions. The forest, already tired, grows thinner, sparser, less resilient. What once stood as a wall of green, firm against the horizon, now shows more gaps. The canopy lets in too much sun in summer, too much wind in winter. This change is not isolated. Across boreal zones from Canada to Russia, data now show that tree growth is plateauing or even declining in many areas. Satellite imagery reveals forests less dense than they were decades ago. On the ground, dendrochronologists, scientists who study tree rings, see signs of stress etched into wood. Rings grow narrower. Their patterns, once steady and predictable, now waver. The trees are speaking in silence, and what they are saying is, we are not sleeping well. Beneath the trees, the forest floor feels this too. Without the predictable pause of winter, decomposition rates increase. Fungi and microbes stay active longer, releasing more greenhouse gases from soil. The carbon cycle accelerates, not because of growth, but because of loss. What was stored slowly over centuries is now released rapidly, invisibly. The ground is losing its breath while the sky takes it in. Even the snow itself has changed. Where thick snowdrifts once fell in November and stayed until April, there are now shallow patches, icy crusts, midwinter melts. This not only disrupts insulation for roots, but affects animals as well. Voles and mice, who tunnel through snow for warmth and safety, find less shelter. Owls, whose hunting patterns rely on snowpack, miss their prey. Caribou migration is affected by snow depth and ice layers. Everything once aligned to the sleep of the forest must now adapt to its insomnia. And in this adapting, some things are lost. There is a kind of quiet that only a deeply sleeping forest can offer. A hush that settles when all life knows it is time to rest. When snow muffles every sound and branches hold still under white weight and even the wind moves more slowly. That hush is thinning now. In some places it is gone altogether, replaced by trickles of meltwater in January, by unexpected winds in February, by the persistent ticking of life that should be paused. Yet amidst the change, the forest continues to try. Some trees shift their chemistry, changing how they manage energy reserves. Some species grow faster in early spring to compensate for late dormancy. Others send roots deeper, searching for moisture in thawed layers below. The forest is not giving up. It is reaching, testing, adjusting. But these adaptations take time, and the climate is changing faster than the forest can learn. Still, there are places where the old rhythm lingers. In shaded valleys where cold air pools and snow stays longer. In higher altitudes where the freeze still comes early and stays late. In patches of moss untouched by fire or melt, the memory of true dormancy remains. These remnants serve as both refuge and reminder, refuge for species that still depend on cold and reminder of what once was possible. Scientists are working to preserve these places. They track the cold spots, study the snowlines, and use their findings to model what forests might look like in 50 years, in 100. Some advocate for assisted migration, planting species from further south that are better suited for future conditions. Others focus on protecting intact ecosystems, reducing stress where they can. The effort is not to return the forest to the past, but to help it find a new kind of rest. Because rest is not only about sleep, it is about balance, the right timing, the right rhythm, the right silence. A forest that forgets how to sleep is a forest always on edge, always spending, never restoring. It becomes thin in body and memory, and yet it can remember if we give it time. Perhaps the greatest hope lies not just in what we do, but in how we listen. If we pay attention to the early bud, the lingering leaf, the mist migration, we begin to understand the language of change. And if we slow ourselves enough to hear it, we might learn how to help the forest sleep again, not as it once did, but in a new rhythm, one shaped by care. As dusk settles across the boreal canopy, a quiet wind moves through the pines. Some trees stand bare, others hold leaves too long. The snow beneath is thin but still white. In the distance, a raven calls, and in the hush that follows, the forest stands, not asleep but dreaming. Now let us linger in the quiet between seasons, where the forest waits without knowing exactly what for. There is a pause in the land, not a restful one, but a moment of searching, like an orchestra that has forgotten the opening note. The air is still but not peaceful. It is filled with questions. Will winter come early this year? Will it stay long enough to help the forest breathe? Or will it arrive as a ghost, present but thin, unable to slow what must be slowed? The forest listens, but the answers, like the snow, no longer arrive as surely as before. In past ages, these lands held their slumber with grace. Winter descended gently but with certainty, folding the forest into its arms and locking the world in a deep, healing stillness. That stillness gave birth to strength. It allowed roots to grow deeper, bark to harden, seeds to sleep without fear of waking too soon. Now, with each year that passes, the once reliable blanket of snow is patchier, thinner, less nourishing. The cold comes in flashes, unpredictable and cruel. And the forest, still wired to rhythms that no longer apply, drifts in and out of a fitful rest. You can feel it in the trees. They wake early but not fully. Their buds swell too soon, vulnerable to a sudden frost. Then the cold bites hard, unseasonal and sharp, burning delicate tips and scarring soft leaves. It is a cruel kind of irony. The very warmth that encourages growth also invites destruction. The cues that once kept life aligned are now unsynchronized. The symphony plays out of tune. This disharmony touches every layer. Beneath the forest floor, the soil no longer freezes as it once did. Microbial life pulses through the winter months, emitting carbon, releasing memories stored for generations. What was once a time of carbon rest has become a time of release. Each winter that fails to fully arrive becomes another exhale from the forest into the sky, a breath once held now lost to warmth. The water changes too. Streams that once froze solid now run beneath fragile ice. Lakes form dark patches where the freeze no longer reaches the bottom. In some places, methane bubbles rise steadily all winter long, freed from thawed soils beneath. The water mirrors the air, confused, shifting, unwilling to commit fully to cold. And through this changing landscape, the animals move with caution. Some migrate earlier, others later. Many are caught in the middle. Caribou calves are born before the right plants have sprouted. Bears wake too soon. Insects appear out of rhythm with flowers. Birds fly thousands of miles only to find that their nesting grounds are still barren. These misalignments ripple outward, touching everything, changing the shape of life itself. Still, the forest endures. In patches of protected land, in groves where snow still gathers deep, there are trees that sleep. They close their pores, they slow their sap, they embrace the cold with ancient trust. These pockets are precious, refuges of the old rhythm, holding on as the world around them shifts. Scientists visit these places often, not just to study, but to remember. They take core samples, measuring age and growth, listening to stories written in rings. And they find that even in a warming world, rest is still possible if given space. Restoration becomes not just a science, but a kind of listening. Forest managers begin to shift their approach. Instead of resisting fire, they learn to work with it. Controlled burns are used carefully to mimic the forest's natural cycles, clearing old growth and allowing light to reach the floor. In doing so, they support the return of balance, preparing the land for both growth and pause. Some researchers explore genetic resilience. They study trees that handle temperature swings more gracefully, that know how to sleep through chaos. Seedlings from these hardy individuals are nurtured and planted with care, a quiet hope growing leaf by leaf. It is not an attempt to reverse time, but to give the forest a chance to evolve alongside it. There is also movement in policy. As awareness of the boreal forest's role in global climate grows, so too does the urgency to protect it. These forests are among the planet's largest carbon stores. Their rest is not just their own, it is ours too. When they forget to sleep, the world becomes restless. When they breathe too much, the sky remembers. To guard their rhythms is to guard the balance of air, of season, of life. But perhaps the greatest work is in remembrance, in the act of paying attention, in walking slowly through a warming forest and noticing the buds, the bark, the ground beneath your feet, in listening for the old rhythms even as they fade. When we remember what the forest once was, we honor its transformation. And when we honor it, we find new ways to care for it, not as something broken, but as something becoming. The forest may never return to the sleep it once knew, but it can learn to rest differently, to hold a new kind of stillness, to breathe with softer exhalations, and in doing so, it may rediscover a rhythm that fits the world it now inhabits. So as dusk falls across the boreal land, and the air cools in a way that feels almost like the past, the trees sway gently. Some are weary, some are waiting, some are already letting go. The snow begins to fall, not heavy, not deep, but enough to cover the ground in a hush. And in that hush the forest pauses, not quite asleep, but not fully awake, just resting, just remembering. The wind that moves through the Arctic carries stories older than language. It brushes across snowfields and forests, over frozen lakes and wide tundra, curling softly around branches that never sleep. This wind has no shape, no color, but it is full of memory, and woven within its breath is something invisible, carbon drifting like a dream. For centuries, the Arctic wind was quiet in its burden. It passed through landscapes that held tightly to their carbon, storing it in ice, in moss, in the deep frozen vault of permafrost. The trees stood like still guardians, drawing carbon from the sky and locking it away in wood and root. The soil beneath was rich and ancient, packed with matter from long-dead plants, layered over generations like pages in a book the earth had not yet read aloud. But now, the wind carries more. As the world warms, the frozen lands begin to stir. Carbon, once sealed in place by cold, begins to awaken. It rises gently at first, tiny threads of carbon dioxide and methane, breathed out by thawing soil by microbes roused from their long slumber. It lifts into the sky on the back of the breeze, into the vastness where it joins the breath of cities, of oceans, of machines. The Arctic is no longer only a listener in the global conversation, it has become a voice. Imagine standing on a snowy rise in the far north, with no sound but the whisper of wind through frost-hardened branches. The sky is pale and endless. The ground beneath your feet seems solid, but beneath that surface lies an immense reservoir of carbon, twice as much as in all the forests of the world combined. Locked in permafrost, it has rested for tens of thousands of years, but that rest is ending. What warms the air above slowly seeps into the soil below. Year by year, the boundary between frozen and thawed shifts downward. This active layer, once thin and shallow, grows deeper, and with it more carbon is released. Microbes, newly awakened, begin to feed. Their feast is invisible but profound. As they digest the once preserved remains of ancient grasses and trees, they emit gases that drift upward unseen but potent. Carbon dioxide is the most familiar of these. It is steady, persistent, and globally understood. But methane, less abundant yet far more powerful, also rises. It emerges from wetlands and thermokarst lakes where melting ground creates new pools. In the stillness of these waters, without oxygen, carbon becomes methane, and this gas does not stay. It rises, it joins the wind, and the wind carries it far. What begins beneath a patch of moss in Siberia might someday influence a storm in the Pacific. The atmosphere does not keep secrets, it shares everything. Scientists have learned to read this invisible language. They build towers in the tundra, slender fingers reaching into the sky, fitted with instruments that sniff the air and record its breath. They fly aircraft through the Arctic clouds, sampling pockets of methane and carbon dioxide, mapping their sources. From satellites above, they watch the Earth's color and temperature change, correlating greenness with carbon drawdown and brown scars with carbon release. Their findings echo the wind's message. The Arctic is changing from sink to source. This change is not loud. There are no alarms sounding in the forest. The shift happens softly, like a sigh too long held, but its effect is vast. What once helped cool the Earth now adds to its fever. It is not because the forest has failed, but because the world around it has changed the terms of its dreaming. In this dream, carbon no longer sleeps. The trees still do their part. Each summer, they reach upward with green hope, drawing carbon into their leaves, turning it into wood and shade and root. But the warming soil beneath undoes some of that work. For every breath the tree inhales, the ground exhales. And more often now, the balance tips toward release. In some regions, this cycle has become a carbon paradox. The forest is growing faster, thanks to longer growing seasons and more warmth. But this growth is not always enough to offset the carbon released by thawing soil and increasing fires. What appears greener from space may still be breathing out more than it takes in. And still, the wind moves on. It curls around rivers that no longer freeze solid. It whistles through valleys where snow arrives too late. It scatters the ash of forests burned by heat and flame, lifting the carbon skyward once again. And wherever it goes, it carries pieces of the past, molecules once held in ancient leaves, now part of the sky. Some call this the carbon awakening, but the Arctic might call it remembering. Because this release is not new, it is a return of breath once taken in, now let go, a return of warmth once hidden, now rising. It is as though the earth is exhaling after a long, frozen pause. The wind carries that exhale across continents, and it becomes part of all of us. Yet there is still mystery in the way carbon moves. Not all permafrost is the same. Some places release quickly, others slowly. Some thaw only at the edges. Some remain untouched, frozen deep and true. The forest, too, varies in its response. Some trees thrive in the warmth, others suffer. Some soils absorb more, others let go without resistance. And so, the wind's song is complex. It is not only sorrow, it is not only warning, it is also possibility. Because within this shift lies a deeper question. How can we dream alongside the earth instead of against it? How can we adjust our breath to support hers? The carbon in the air is not evil, it is part of the cycle. But the cycle must hold balance, and balance requires rest, restraint, rhythm. The north wind, heavy with ancient breath, calls us to remember that we too are part of this pattern. That every fire lit, every tree planted, every mile driven joins the conversation. That the wind is not separate, it is the link between us. And maybe, if we listen carefully enough, we will hear not just the warning in its whisper, but the invitation.
To shift,
To soften. To remember how to dream gently, as the carbon once did beneath the snow. Let us drift further now, carried by the same quiet wind that brushes across the tree line and ripples over ice-thinned lakes. This wind does not speak in human tones, but if you sit long enough beside a northern spruce or among the tundra moss, you might begin to hear what it carries, not in words but in rhythm. There is a pulse to it, a memory, a reminder that the carbon beneath our feet has never truly slept, only waited, and now it moves. Beneath the Arctic's moss and lichens lies not just frozen ground, but a living archive of the planet's breath. Permafrost, once thought to be permanent, is beginning to soften, and with that softness comes release. Every gram of thawing peat is a story unraveling, a moment in time transformed back into motion. The microbes that stir in this softening ground are ancient, but they know their task well. In darkness and silence, they convert organic matter into gas and the gas into sky. This sky increasingly carries the scent of time undone. The carbon dioxide and methane released are not modern. They are not from today's forests or yesterday's fuels. They come from a colder age, a time when woolly mammoths roamed and forests crept cautiously toward the poles. The air above us is mixing with this older world, and in that mixing, the future bends. Thermokarst landscapes, those shaped by the collapse of thawing permafrost, are growing across the north. These are not dramatic shifts. They do not roar or crack, but they change the shape of the earth. Hills slump, lakes deepen and darken. Rivers wander from their beds. From above, the land looks pitted and bruised. On foot, it feels uneven, as if the forest has begun to exhale too deeply and the breath has changed the shape of its lungs. And within these breaths, carbon dreams. Not with intention or malice, but as a function of change. The forest is not trying to warm the earth, it is responding to the world warming it. The trees continue their work. They draw down carbon when they can, but their roots are shifting in soil that is no longer firm. Their leaves reach for a sun that lingers longer, but not always with kindness. Some species adapt. Shrubs take advantage of the warming season, spreading across what was once open tundra. In doing so, they change albedo, the measure of how much light the earth reflects. Where white snow once bounced sunlight back into space, dark branches now absorb it, warming the ground further. Even the color of the landscape becomes part of the feedback loop. And still, the carbon moves. It moves in forms we cannot see, dissolved in water, clinging to soil particles, or floating in the air as gas. It drifts downstream in the thawed runoffs, flowing into Arctic rivers, which in turn carry it to the ocean. Along the way, some of it is consumed by microbes, turned into yet more carbon dioxide. Some of it lingers in the water, altering its chemistry, feeding plankton blooms, or changing how sunlight penetrates beneath the surface. The Arctic Ocean, once protected by thick layers of sea ice, is now more exposed. Its surface warms more each summer. More open water means more evaporation, more cloud formation, more unpredictable weather patterns. It also means more opportunity for carbon exchange between air and sea, between ice and wind. The boundary that once separated the sky from the deep has become porous. Researchers in icebreakers and remote sensing labs follow these patterns with quiet precision. They track the flux of carbon from ground to sky, from forest to ocean. They build models to anticipate what may come. How much carbon will be released if permafrost thaws 1 meter deeper or 2? They input variables, fire, rainfall, snow depth, microbial response, and wait for answers. But the models, though improving, can only go so far. There are pieces of the story still hidden. Some permafrost may remain stable for decades, protected by certain soils or shaded microclimates. Some wetlands may shift from sources to sinks, drawing in carbon even as others let it go. There is still time to act, to listen, to change course. But that window is not infinite. It narrows with each warm winter, each fire that burns through peat, each breath of methane released from a thawed lake. And still, the dream continues. Because carbon, like all elements, is part of a larger cycle, a dance between the living and the dead, between the soil and the stars. The carbon that leaves the Arctic does not vanish. It joins the atmosphere, changes the climate, affects the growth of crops in distant fields, the strength of storms, the melting of glaciers far to the south. It connects us all, whether we breathe near birch trees or traffic lights, whether we walk on ice or asphalt. This connection is not metaphorical, it is physical, measurable, real. The molecules released from a patch of thawing moss may circle the globe and return as rain in another hemisphere. The wind that gathers warmth over darkened Arctic seas may help shape drought in distant plains. And as the Arctic releases its breath, we feel it everywhere, not all at once, but always. And yet, even now, we are not without choices. The carbon is dreaming, yes, but it does not dream alone. We are part of this cycle. What we burn, what we preserve, how we build and move and grow, all of it joins the atmosphere's breath. If the Arctic is waking from its slumber, we can choose to meet it gently, to reduce the burden we place on the wind, to protect the forests that still hold more than they release, to restore wetlands, reduce emissions, rethink our energy, to give the land time to adjust. Not to return to what was, that time has passed, but to shape what comes. To help the carbon find new places to rest, to plant trees that grow with resilience, to let fire play its natural role without letting it rage unchecked, to understand that the Arctic's breath is no longer a whisper we can ignore. It is part of our story now. And in that story, there is still time for care. As the wind quiets for a moment over a frozen stream, you might almost hear it, the faint rustling of grass where moss once lay, the sigh of thawing ground, the soft lifting of gases into pale light. The carbon dreams on, and in its dreaming it waits for what we choose next. Now we follow the last breath of the northern wind as it carries us into a quieter space, where the urgency of change softens into reflection. The carbon that once lay hidden, deep beneath the frost, now drifts through the air, invisible yet everywhere. It surrounds the trees, it warms the rivers, it lingers in the sky. But within its movement is not only consequence, it is also remembrance and the chance to begin again with understanding. This carbon released from the Arctic's thawing soils is not merely a number in a data sheet. It is the echo of ancient time. It is the final exhale of Ice Age forests, the forgotten breath of mammoth grasslands, the crumbled remains of prehistoric wetlands. Now, as those frozen stories rise into the warming air, they do not vanish. They join the present, they shape it, they ask us to listen. And as we listen, we begin to see that carbon does not dream in isolation. It is carry. On the breath of forests, on the exhale of soil, in the bloom of plankton, and in the firelight of burning trees. It flows between all living things, binding us in a loop so vast and slow it almost escapes our notice, until it changes. The Arctic, once the great freezer of time, is now becoming a river of release. And this transformation brings both risk and revelation. It reminds us that nature is never truly static, that what feels eternal, the permafrost, the snowpack, the frozen ground, is still subject to change, given enough warmth, enough time, and time is precisely what we no longer have in abundance. But time is also what we are being given now, not in limitless quantity, but in meaningful presence. We are living in the breath between what was and what could still be, and in this breath there is room for choice. Across the north, efforts have begun to respond, not in panic but in care. Scientists are mapping permafrost vulnerability, identifying places where protection could make the most difference. Land managers are exploring how to maintain cold soil through shading, revegetation, and the careful stewardship of fire. Indigenous communities who have long lived with the land rather than over it are offering knowledge rooted in observation, in deep attention, in a kind of knowing that transcends measurement. From the edge of Alaska to the valleys of Siberia, people are listening to the land again. And what the land is saying is simple, though not easy. Slow down the burn, let the forest rest, give the moss a chance to regrow, give the snow more time to fall. These are not grand gestures, but small, vital ones. They do not reverse the course, but they may help guide it, because carbon will continue to move. The question is how much and how fast, and what we choose to do with the knowledge that we are now part of its path. It is tempting to think of the Earth as something separate, something vast, beyond reach. But the carbon in the north wind is a gentle reminder that nothing is separate, that what rises from melting permafrost is breathed in by distant forests, that the warmth released in one region can stir the weather in another, that the dreams of the Arctic become the climate of us all. Still the forest stands, the rivers flow, the sky is not yet closed. There is beauty in the resilience that remains, beauty in the buds that still form, in the moss that carpets scorched ground, in the lichens that reclaim rock, and beauty in the fact that we are not powerless, only responsible. Responsible for our choices, for the carbon we add, for the silence we break, for the forests we defend. Responsible, too, for the stories we tell ourselves, about growth, about energy, about what progress truly means. Because perhaps progress is not only in building, but in listening, not only in reaching forward, but in turning gently toward what we've overlooked, in planting trees we may never sit beneath, in protecting ground we may never walk, in honoring the wind not just as a force, but as a voice. So what now? We take what we know, that the Arctic is warming, that permafrost is releasing, that carbon is rising, and we ask quietly and clearly what can be done. We focus on drawdown, on restoration, on slowing what need not rush. We hold governments to their promises. We support those protecting peatlands, managing fire, preserving old-growth forests. We shift energy where we can and influence where we cannot. And all the while, we remember that the Earth is not asking for perfection, only partnership. Let the carbon move, but not all at once. Let the ice melt, but slower. Let the forests breathe, but also rest. Let the wind carry not just our emissions, but our intentions. Because if the Arctic has taught us anything, it is that even in stillness, change unfolds. Even in silence, voices rise. Even in frozen ground, life dreams. And those dreams of balance, of harmony, of enough, do not belong only to the wind, they belong to all of us. As the northern lights shimmer faintly in a darkened sky, and the snow settles soft over sleeping lichen, the wind stirs once more. It moves past the trunks of trees that still stand. It brushes the cheeks of those who listen. It carries carbon, yes, but also memory, also potential, also peace. And then it moves on, waiting for us to follow, not with haste, but with care. Beneath the moss and lichen, beneath the soft scatter of needles and the fallen bones of leaves, something ancient moves without sound. Roots thin and thick, tangled and deep, stretch through the soil like slow lightning. They are not seen, but they are everywhere, weaving a web beneath the forest floor, touching stone, water, and memory. In the cold of the Arctic, these roots once whispered only in summer, resting still through the long frost. But now the soil is changing. It is warmer, wetter, thawing. And the roots whisper longer. The ground that once froze solid each year is no longer garant. Ed to hold permafrost, the cold keeper of time, is losing its grip. In the space where ice melts, the soil becomes restless. It shifts, softens, collapses. Water gathers where none stood before. The roots that once held firm begin to twist and sink. Some reach farther, seeking stability. Others fracture in place. And in their quiet language, they begin to tell the story of a forest learning how to stand in a world that won't stop warming. Plants do not speak in words, but they are not silent. Their messages travel through air, through chemical signals, through the deep network of fungi that wraps itself around their roots like lace. This underground web, called the mycorrhizal network, connects one tree to another. Through it, trees share nutrients, warnings, and whispers of change. The warming soil alters this conversation. The timing shifts. The signals arrive early or late or not at all. The harmony that once shaped this hidden world is beginning to slip. In the Arctic, roots grow shallow because frozen ground lies close. Trees like black spruce send thin roots outward, not down, resting atop the permafrost like fingers on a glass table. They evolved for this. For millennia, the cold beneath offered stability, but now as that frozen barrier softens, their foundation weakens. The soil sags, water gathers, whole stands of spruce begin to tilt, leaning into the wind like drunks caught mid-step. In Alaska, these forests are called drunken forests, a quiet tragedy written in posture. And yet the roots continue to search. Warmer soils allow them to grow longer into the season, even into winter. Microbial activity no longer stops when it once did. The roots interact with a busier, more unpredictable world. Nutrients that were once locked in ice become suddenly available. This could be a gift, but only if the roots can keep up with the change. Often they cannot. Warming soils dry more easily, especially in summer heat. The balance between thaw and drought becomes delicate. When the top layer of soil dries while deeper layers remain wet or frozen, roots struggle to find consistent water. They stretch downward, risking exposure to unstable ground. In some regions, trees begin to die not from cold but from thirst, ironic in a place surrounded by melting ice. As roots weaken, so does the forest's grip on the soil. Erosion increases, hillsides slump, sediment runs into streams, clouding water, affecting fish, and reshaping river paths. The roots that once stitched the earth together can no longer hold as tightly. Their whispers grow faint beneath the noise of movement, of melt, of change. Still beneath the shifting surface, a story continues. Some species adapt. Willow and alder with more flexible roots begin to take hold where spruce retreats. These shrubs, with their faster growth and nitrogen-fixing abilities, change the chemistry of the soil. They invite different insects, different fungi, different rhythms. The web reshapes itself. The forest shifts in kind, not dying but transforming, responding with every root and breath. The microbial world below is also shifting. Warming soil wakes organisms that once slept for most of the year. They churn through organic matter, breaking it down faster, releasing nutrients and greenhouse gases. Their work speeds up the cycle, increasing carbon emissions from soil even as plants try to reclaim them. It is a quiet tug-of-war beneath the surface, where cooperation and competition blur. In these warming soils, roots also face new diseases. Pathogens once kept in check by the cold now find favorable conditions. Fungi that damage roots spread more easily. Plants already weakened by drought or tilt succumb more quickly. The balance of below-ground life becomes fragile, more responsive to stress, more easily tipped. Yet amid these changes, there is resilience. Some trees form new partnerships with fungi, seeking allies better suited for the new warmth. Some roots split and reform, adapting their shapes to the softer ground. The forest is not passive. It tries, it reaches. It learns in the only way it knows, by growing into the unknown. Scientists explore these underground shifts with tools that echo the gentleness of the roots themselves. Soil cores are extracted with care. Microscopes peer into fungal filaments. Isotopes trace the movement of carbon from root to sky. And always the question lingers: what is being said beneath the surface, and how are the roots rewriting their language to meet this moment? Because what happens below determines what rises above. If the roots can adjust, the trees may hold. If the soil can stay stable, the carbon might stay in place. If the mycorrhizal networks can adapt, the forest might retain its cohesion. These are not just botanical concerns, they are climate ones. What happens in the dark places, beneath the moss, beneath the snow, will shape the breath of the world. And so we listen, not with ears, but with curiosity. Why? Respect, with a willingness to see the soil not as dirt, but as memory. A living, breathing archive of carbon, of water, of warmth and cold. A place where every root, no matter how small, is part of something larger. As evening falls over a thorn grove and the moss glows faintly gold in the last light, the roots continue their quiet work. They reach into a soil that is no longer what it was, but not yet what it will be. They whisper to fungi. They stretch toward water. They remember the cold and they prepare for warmth. And in their slow, silent language, they hold the future in place, thread by thread, breath by breath. Let us follow those roots further now, into the deeper places where time is buried in the dark. Below the thawed topsoil and down into the ancient frost line lies a vast underworld, a vault of ice-bound carbon, of forgotten summers pressed into layers of frozen peat. For thousands of years, roots reached this boundary and stopped. They paused where the world turned cold, but now the line is moving. The freeze is no longer permanent. The threshold between frozen and thawed grows softer, lower, unstable. And the roots, long accustomed to stopping, now slip through. This change is not sudden. It comes as a quiet drift, a degree here, a day there, and with each inch of thaw, new pathways open. What was once inert becomes active. Organic material, untouched by air for millennia, is now exposed to oxygen and warmth. The process begins. Bacteria stir, fungi wake, and slowly decomposition breathes life and gases back into the atmosphere. It is a conversation between worlds, the frozen and the warm, the past and the present. The roots that reach into this new terrain do so with caution. Their growth is not aggressive. It is exploratory, slow, tentative. But the consequences are immense, for as they expand, they disturb the once quiet store of carbon beneath. And in their wake, microbes follow, feeding on the sudden feast, exhaling carbon dioxide and methane into the softening air. These emissions rise from beneath, not with smoke or flame, but in invisible threads. They drift through soil pores, join the breath of mosses and lichens, and slip upward into the sky. The roots don't know they're releasing carbon. They only know the ground is changing, that warmth now reaches where cold once ruled. But their movement, however quiet, stirs something larger. And this stirring has become measurable. In recent years, scientists have recorded significant increases in carbon flux from permafrost regions. Remote sensors track subtle shifts in elevation as ground sinks and swells with seasonal thaw. In boreal Canada and northern Alaska, airborne methane levels have spiked unexpectedly during what were once cold, dormant months. These are not anomalies. They are the new rhythm of a soil learning to stay awake too long. The implications stretch far beyond the forest floor. As carbon escapes from these thawing landscapes, it adds to the warming of the planet, and that warming deepens the thaw, a feedback loop, a cycle that spins on the breath of unseen roots, on the warmth that seeps too far. Each season of release adds momentum. Each quiet exhale becomes part of a louder global storm. But it is not only gases that move. As the ground softens, so too do the paths of water. Melting permafrost changes how rivers flow. It alters the chemistry of lakes, increasing nutrient loads, decreasing oxygen, stirring algae into sudden bloom. And with this water come particles, fine soil, dissolved carbon, ancient organic fragments. These travel downstream, changing the ecosystems far beyond the Arctic, feeding into deltas, estuaries, coastal shelves. Even the ocean listens to the land now. And the roots continue to adapt. In some places, they follow the warmth and flourish, tapping new sources of nutrients once locked away. In others, they meet too much water and drown in saturation. Not all roots are suited for this new soil, some rot in place. Some send out desperate shoots to escape pooling meltwater. Entire forest stands begin to shift in response, not just in species, but in shape. What was once upright becomes leaning. What was once still becomes sinking. We see this most clearly in thermokarst terrain, where the ground collapses after ice-rich permafrost melts. These sudden subsides create sinkholes, trenches, and new wetlands. In their formation, they destroy existing vegetation, but also create new habitats. Water-loving species take hold. Aquatic insects arrive. Beavers return. In this shifting land, loss and adaptation move hand in hand. Still, not all changes find balance. Many of the forest's old relationships between roots and fungi, between soil and water, begin to fray. Mycorrhizal fungi, sensitive to temperature and moisture, may fail to connect with trees in the same way. Without these underground partnerships, trees lose their lifelines. They struggle to gather nutrients to resist disease, to remain upright in wet or loose soil. And yet, the forest does not fall silent. Instead, it searches, it tries. Some roots abandon old fungal allies and find new ones. Some plants adjust their timing, shifting when they leaf, when they bloom, when they rest. There is no blueprint for this adaptation, only the long patience of life responding to change inch by inch, cell by cell. Humans, too, are part of this response. In the far north, indigenous communities have long understood the soil not as static ground, but as living story. Their observations of tree length, of thaw depth, of changing water flow, are vital to understanding what is unfolding beneath. Paired with satellite data and climate models, these lived experiences provide a fuller picture, one rooted in both technology and memory. And with this picture comes responsibility. Because the carbon being released from these warming soils is not only natural, it is also reactive. The more we burn, the more we warm. The more we warm, the more we thaw. The more we thaw, the more carbon escapes. And on it goes, a spiral fed not by malice but by momentum. But momentum can be redirected. There are efforts to protect permafrost regions, to slow the loss of soil carbon. Techniques include insulating vulnerable areas with layers of vegetation, redirecting water to reduce saturation, even rebuilding ground layers through ecological engineering. These approaches are small compared to the scale of change, but meaningful. They buy time. They offer the land a slower path. Reforestation plays a role as well. New trees can help stabilize soils, shade the ground, and support microbial communities that slow carbon release. But these efforts must be made with care, with knowledge of the species that belong, of the soil that lies beneath, of the climate that is now reshaping the rules. Because this is no longer a forest of memory, it is a forest in the process of becoming. Its roots still whisper, but the messages are different now. They speak of resilience, of risk, of the delicate tension between survival and loss. They stretch into ground that no longer rests, searching not for what was, but for what might still hold. As twilight deepens and a soft breeze moves through the lichen and brush, the forest bends slightly. Its roots flex in the warming ground, adjusting, learning, reaching. And far below, where ice once ruled and now only shadows remain, a new language is forming, spoken in water, in carbon, in the silent stretch of roots learning how to hold a world that will not stop changing. Now let us settle into the final layer, where the roots no longer seek only water or warmth, but meaning. The soil beneath a changing Arctic holds more than carbon. It holds memory, and as it thaws, those memories return not as words or sounds, but as breath, as decay, as renewal. The roots that once slept beneath frozen moss are now awake longer, feeling the shape of time bending beneath them. They reach, not knowing if the ground will hold, but reaching anyway. In the stillness of a lowland forest, where snow comes late and melts early, the change is no longer a question. The moss is too thin, the soil too soft, and the trees tilt in every direction like silent question marks. This is not the collapse of a system, but its reorganization, a slow shifting of rules that life must learn in real time. Roots that once spread laterally across a frozen crust now dive deeper, chasing uncertain water, but deeper brings risk. The ice that once marked the bottom has melted. Below is wetness, instability, sometimes even voids, and yet they grow. In some places, this downward movement opens new possibilities. Nutrients once locked in frozen layers become available. Microbial communities shift and new combinations emerge, some beneficial, some disruptive. A tree might flourish for a few years, fed by unexpected bounty, only to falter later as water pools around its base and rot sets in. Others, more flexible in their partnerships and timing, begin to reshape the forest's future. This future looks different. Spruce give way to willow and alder. The undergrowth thickens with grasses and shrubs, feeding animals that once passed this land by. Insects, too, follow the warming, bringing their own rhythms. The soil, once hushed under a deep freeze, hums with activity almost year-round. The forest no longer sleeps as it did, and so it no longer dreams in the same way. And yet there is beauty in this shift, not in nostalgia, but in witnessing the resilience of life responding with every fiber of its being. A root cannot choose its season, but it can choose how it grows within it. In this warmer, wetter world, roots explore more than they ever have. They intertwine more densely, seeking stability not from depth, but from each other. Some trees even send resources through these root networks to neighbors more in need, an act of survival that looks a great deal like cooperation. It is here, beneath the shifting surface, that the future of the forest will be decided, not by what stands tallest above, but by what holds strongest below. Because it is the soil and the life within it that governs whether this land continues to store carbon or release it, whether the breath of the forest is one of calming intake or warming exhale. In the last light of a shortened winter day, a scientist kneels near the base of a leaning tree. She takes a coarse sample, careful not to disturb the fragile ground. Through her hands, centuries of stored time pass, fragments of leaves, spores, broken cells from long-forgotten summers. She knows this forest is not what it once was and likely never will be again. But she also knows it is still alive, still speaking, still rooted in its own kind of wisdom. That wisdom lies not in permanence, but in response. Every organism in the soil, from the smallest bacterium to the oldest root, plays a role in this transformation. Together they negotiate each season, each storm, each moment of heat or melt. It is a chorus of adaptation, not always successful, not always kind, but ongoing, real. It reminds us that resilience is not about resistance, it is about relationship. We see that in how roots wrap around rocks, how they navigate patches of permafrost that still hold, how they avoid rot by seeking just the right depth, the right angle. We see it in the fungal threads that expand with the warming season, providing nutrients where once there was none. We see it in the new species arriving, plants with faster life cycles, animals with different diets, changing the soil from above while the roots respond from below. This dance is delicate, and we are not outside of it. Every emission we send into the sky circles back into this soil. Every degree of warming affects the freeze line. Every policy decision, every act of carelessness or attention shifts the chemistry beneath our feet. The carbon that escapes from these thawing grounds is part of our story now, not just nature's story, not just the Arctic's. It is global, shared, bound to us through the atmosphere we all breathe. And so we arrive at the question that roots can never ask, but we must: what now? We can learn from the patience of roots, from their ability to listen to the soil, to grow where they are, to build networks rather than walls. We can reduce the pressure on these systems by changing how we live, burning less, preserving more, honoring what is still intact. We can choose to see the soil not as an afterthought, but as a foundation, to treat every inch of ground as both a history and a promise. Because beneath every step we take is something that is trying to hold on, something living, stretching, whispering in the language of roots. And though we may not hear it clearly, we are part of that whisper. Our choices echo underground. As the evening deepens and frost begins to form, not as it once did, but still enough to hush the moss, the roots pause. They do not stop, not entirely, but they rest just slightly, just enough. And in that pause is something like hope, not a promise but a possibility, that the ground will hold a little longer, that the carbon will stay buried a little deeper, that the future, though uncertain, still contains threads of resilience woven through its soil. The roots whisper still, and if we lean close enough into the thaw, into the warmth, into the breath of the forest, we might just hear them say, "We are still here. We are still holding on." There is a kind of silence found only in frozen places, not the silence of emptiness, but of stillness, the hush that blankets the land when everything is asleep. In the Arctic, this silence has long been sacred. It lives in the frozen soil, in the muffled footsteps of animals crossing snowdrifts, in the deep breath of forests settled beneath winter skies. It is a silence that once signaled rest, stability, pause, but now something is changing. The ground, once sealed by ice, is beginning to thaw. And in that thawing, the silence itself is shifting. The permafrost, Earth's ancient vault, has been locked for tens of thousands of years. Within it lies a record of time, of fallen leaves, buried roots, moss and bones and microbes paused mid-task. Frozen soil is quiet not only because it does not move, but because the life within it is held still, like a heartbeat slowed into hibernation. But with warmth, the heartbeat resumes. With thaw, the hush is broken not in noise but in movement. The ground begins to breathe, to sink, to speak in the language of release. This change does not begin with earthquakes or eruptions. It begins with softness, a patch of moss that stays damp too long, a stream that no longer freezes all the way through, a hollow forming where once the ground was firm. The thaw spreads like water through fabric, seeping, stretching, loosening the bonds of soil and stone. What was once hard becomes pliable. What was once quiet begins to stir. In this new silence, something else grows. Beneath the surface, microbes awaken. These ancient organisms, frozen for centuries, begin to digest the organic matter that thaw reveals. They consume the remains of leaves and roots preserved in ice, and in doing so they release gases, carbon dioxide and methane. These gases drift upward, joining the atmosphere's breath, changing its composition. Slowly, the silence becomes a source of heat. Thermokarst is the word used to describe the land reshaped by melting permafrost. It sounds gentle, but its effects are vast. Hills collapse, forests tilt, lakes form where once there were none. The ground buckles and dips. Entire landscapes change character, not with drama but with inevitability. In some places, the trees still stand, their roots exposed like veins, unable to hold the shifting soil. In others, water pools in shallow craters, reflecting a sky that no longer knows when to snow. And still the silence grows, not the silence of rest, but of absence. Birds return to find the insects they depend on have hatched too early. Foxes follow scent trails that end in meltwater. Caribou tread across land too soft to support them. In places where the ground has sunk, entire ecosystems are displaced. The rhythm is disrupted. The harmony begins to fray. And yet this silence carries stories. Scientists listen closely. They track ground temperature with buried sensors, monitor the carbon escaping from thawing wetlands, measure the height and spread of subsidence. Satellites trace the deforming terrain, mapping it year after year, seeing how the Earth itself remembers what it means to breathe differently. In this data, a new narrative emerges. The Arctic is speaking not in sound, but in silence. It is telling us what happens when memory stored in cold is released into a world that has grown too warm. The silence is not uniform. It grows in patches like a bruise on the landscape. In some areas, permafrost is only a few inches below the surface, already warmed to the edge of melting. In others, it lies deeper, but the warmth still reaches. The surface vegetation plays a role. Darker leaves absorb more sunlight, heating the ground below. Fires, once rare, now more frequent, remove insulating moss and lichen, leaving bare soil to absorb the sun. Rain replaces snow, and with it, the insulating layer of winter thins. All of these changes build upon one another, layer by layer, until the stillness beneath begins to tremble. And once the thaw begins, it is hard to stop. Unlike seasonal melting, permafrost thaw is cumulative. The ground does not refreeze to its former depth. Each warm season eats further into the frozen core, making the next thaw deeper, faster. In some regions, the active layer, the zone that melts each summer, is now a meter deeper than it was only decades ago. With each centimeter lost, the forest above shifts. Roots lose their hold, water tables rise, and the quiet, which once meant protection, now means exposure. But even in this silence, there are signs of life. New wetlands form where land collapses. These shallow pools attract birds, insects, amphibians. Peatlands long frozen may begin to support sedges and grasses. Some areas grow green with a startling speed. It is tempting to see this as rebirth, but it is a different kind of life, shaped not by balance but by reaction. Not all species benefit. Some lose the ground beneath their feet. Communities living near thawing permafrost feel the change firsthand. Buildings tilt, roads crack, traditional hunting trails become impassable. Infrastructure once built with frozen soil as its foundation becomes unstable. In places like northern Canada, Alaska, and Siberia, residents must adapt rapidly to a land they've known for generations, a land that is no longer the same. Their knowledge, passed down through stories and seasons, now must stretch to hold a world that shifts even as it is spoken. And through it all, the silence deepens. Not because there is less life, but because the old signals are gone. The crisp crack of frost in early autumn is replaced by the soft drip of rain. The muffled sound of snow underfoot gives way to the squelch of thawing ground. These are small changes, but they matter. They change the feel of a place. They alter how we listen. Because the Arctic is not only a place, it is a voice. A voice that once whispered in frost, in stillness, in cold that wrapped the world in memory. Now it speaks through transformation, through a quiet release, through the warmth that rises from the ground like breath, and we are being asked to hear it, not as a warning, but as a truth. That even silence is a signal, that even stillness holds power, that the thaw is not only something that happens far away, but something that touches everything everywhere. As twilight falls over a soggy plain and a breeze moves through the grasses where ice once ruled, the land exhales. It makes no sound, but the silence that follows is heavy, full, and in that fullness lies a question, still forming like frost that has not yet settled. Will we listen before the silence becomes something else? The silence continues to unfold, not in absence but in layers, like peeling back time with gentle fingers. Each layer of thawed soil reveals a deeper part of Earth's memory. It is not a silence of emptiness, but one filled with the hum of processes too slow for human hearing. Beneath the moss, beneath the roots, beneath the icy crust once trusted to hold, ancient warmth is waking. And as it rises, it brings with it a quiet transformation, not only of ground, but of everything that depends upon it. This silence is shaped not by stillness alone, but by movement we can barely see. Water seeps through what was once solid, ice turns to mush. Roots once blocked by frozen ground now wander into looser, darker soil. Microbes bloom in places that were silent for millennia. And they do what they have always done. They eat, they breathe, they multiply. But now with warmth their appetite accelerates. They feast on the long-held relics of ancient forests and forgotten wetlands, mosses and roots and tiny, preserved organisms, breaking them down and sending their essence upward into the air. The gases they release do not roar or explode. They rise slowly like sighs that have waited too long. Carbon dioxide from aerobic respiration, methane from anaerobic decay in waterlogged soils. These gases drift unseen into the atmosphere, one molecule at a time, joining the air we all breathe. They are quiet, but they are not benign. Their accumulation thickens the Earth's invisible blanket, warming the planet further, ensuring that even deeper layers of permafrost begin to thaw. The silence beneath becomes an engine above. There are no clear lines here, no sudden thresholds. The change is fluid, the edges blur, forest becomes bog, bog becomes pond, ground becomes waterlogged. In the absence of frost, ecosystems reassemble themselves into something both familiar and strange. Some plants thrive in this new warmth, others vanish, unable to tolerate the wet, the instability, the altered soil chemistry. The balance, once delicately tuned over centuries, begins to tilt. Thermokarst lakes appear overnight in some places, as the ice-rich ground gives way. These shallow, dark pools absorb sunlight, warming the surrounding soil even further. Methane bubbles rise through the water, sometimes visibly. In winter, when lakes freeze over, pressure builds beneath the ice. In some cases, the gas escapes in small explosions, leaving circular scars in the snow, reminders that the silence below is anything but still. Scientists try to measure this transformation with the tools they have: satellite images, core samples, gas flux towers, temperature probes. Each instrument records a version of the truth, piecing together a picture of a land rewriting itself. But the pace of change is hard to predict. Some patches of permafrost remain stable, protected by thick moss, shaded by canopy, held firm by cold winds. Others collapse suddenly, disturbed by wildfire, rainfall, or subtle shifts in hydrology. There is no map that can fully anticipate the silence when it chooses to break. Amid all this, life continues, not unchanged but not defeated. Willows send out roots into wetter ground. New species of moss creep into exposed patches. Bacteria evolve quickly, adapting to warmer, more oxygen-rich environments. The silence that once signaled pause now becomes a space for negotiation, a biological dialogue shaped by conditions that did not exist a century ago. In this reshaping, some of the Arctic's most ancient voices are lost. Lichens, slow-growing and fragile, die back in areas too wet or too fire-scarred. Insects tied to specific temperature ranges vanish, taking with them the birds that once relied on their emergence. The silence that grows is not only in the ground, but in the air, the absence of wings, the stillness of a season missing its song. But still, there are new voices. Frogs move into newly formed wetlands. Shrubs bloom earlier, thickening the landscape with color and scent. Beavers return to areas newly shaped by thaw, carving out new habitats. What was once frozen and sparse becomes noisy and green, if only briefly. Yet even this noise cannot fully mask what has been lost, because underneath every new bloom is a question of endurance. Will it last, or will the ground beneath it give way? Communities across the North feel this tension deeply. Roads crack, pipelines buckle, buildings tilt. What once was reliable ground becomes a variable surface, impossible to trust. For those whose homes have always rested on permafrost, adaptation is not academic, it is survival. Some villages have relocated. Others have reinforced foundations, rerouted water, or built on gravel pads. But these are temporary solutions to a deep and spreading issue. The cultural silence is just as profound. Elders speak of changes that don't match memory. Rivers freeze too late, animal migrations shift, foods gathered for generations now arrive out of season or not at all. The stories no longer match the land, and so the stories must stretch. Oral history becomes elastic, trying to hold a world that is no longer waiting to be told. It is already in motion. And yet there is a quiet dignity in how people adapt, in how knowledge is shared, in how traditions continue not in spite of change but through it. Children learn how to read the new land with old tools. They learn to watch the clouds, the insects, the shifting colors of leaves. The silence they inherit is not empty. It is rich with meaning, with history, with the weight of questions asked in long pauses. And through all of this, the ground keeps changing. The earth does not mourn its own thaw. It simply transforms. It moves from one state to another. But in doing so, it reveals our own place in the story, not separate from it, but deeply embedded. We have become part of the warming that awakens these soils. We are part of the carbon that rises, and so we must also become part of the response. There are efforts underway, scientific, political, ecological, restoration of moss and peat to insulate the ground, protection of old forests that shade and cool the soil, reductions in emissions from fossil fuels to slow the wider warming. Each of these is a thread, fragile alone but strong when woven together. They cannot reverse what has already begun, but they may slow it. They may give the silence space to rest again. As the Arctic sun dips lower in the sky, and the wind carries the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, the silence grows once more. Not the silence of collapse, but of potential, of transition, of deep humming change. The ground, though softer, still holds, and in its holding we find not only uncertainty, but responsibility. To listen, to respond, to tread lightly, knowing that each step echoes in soil still learning how to be warm. In the far reaches of the boreal forest, where the land stretches long beneath pale skies, there are trees that once knew cold like a lullaby. Spruce and fir, larch and pine, these were children of frost, shaped by seasons that came and went with solemn rhythm. They learned to grow slowly, to bend beneath the weight of snow, to harden their needles against wind that howled through endless nights. Cold was their compass, their calendar, their memory. But now the cold is leaving. And the trees, left behind, do not know what to do with the warmth. This warmth is not sudden. It came like a tide that rises quietly at first, lapping against the edges unnoticed. A few more warm days in spring, a shorter frost in autumn, rain falling where snow once rained, and then slowly the shape of the year began to change. Winters that no longer held, summers that pushed too far. The forest began to forget the rules that once defined its growth. For the trees, this change began in their cells. Dormancy, the sacred sleep of winter, became confused. The cues that signaled rest, lengthening nights, dropping temperatures, arrived out of order. Some trees entered dormancy late, others not at all. When sudden cold returned, as it still does in brief, sharp spells, the damage was deep. Buds blackened, branches cracked, bark split in ways it had never split before. But beyond the wounds you can see, deeper changes were underway. The soil that once froze deeply and held moisture now lingered in thawed uncertainty. Roots, used to resting in cold, began to behave strangely, growing when they should have paused, pausing when they should have grown. Fungal partners shifted. Nutrient cycles staggered. The underground rhythms unraveled slowly, like a song losing its tempo. And above ground, the forest began to shimmer with unfamiliar light. The canopy grew thinner in some places. In others, shrubs rushed into new space, their leaves catching sunlight meant for moss. Where once snow-covered needles sparkled under pale blue skies, now water pooled. Rain fell too often or not at all. The trees, no longer guided by frost, responded unevenly. Some grew faster, flush with warmth. Others languished, unable to sync with the soil beneath them. This forest was no longer unified by cold, it was fragmented by heat. The migration of warmth brought guests as well. Insects that once perished in winter now survived and multiplied. Spruce beetles carved pathways into bark with new ease, unchecked by deep freeze. Moths defoliated wide stretches of woodland. Fungal diseases moved northward, carried by air, by water, by wind. The trees, already out of rhythm, could not defend themselves the way they once had. Some stood strong for years, then failed suddenly. Others fell silently, unnoticed in the thick underbrush. And still, new trees came. Species from the south, drawn by rising temperatures, began to spread. Birch grew taller. Faster, aspen shimmered into regions once ruled by spruce. These newcomers changed the texture of the forest, different shapes, different roots, different shadows. They altered the microclimate beneath the canopy. They welcomed different birds, different insects. A new kind of forest was forming, one that did not remember the cold in the same way. But the old trees still stood, quiet sentinels holding their memory. Some larch still turned gold in autumn, even when frost did not come. Some firs still bent in preparation for snows that no longer arrived. Their habits remained, even as the seasons failed to match them. They had not forgotten, but the world around them no longer reinforced what they knew. And in this quiet mismatch, a kind of sorrow took root. It is not easy to see the grief of a forest. It does not weep in the ways we recognize, but it shows in the way trees lean, in the way their crowns thin, in the rings that tell of 2 warm winters and 2 dry summers. Dendrochronologists, those who read the story of trees through their growth rings, have noticed the signs: stress, disruption, years of struggle written in the width and density of wood. But the forest does not stop. It does not give up. Even trees that lose their leaves too early still put out new ones in spring. Even roots that rot in shallow soil try to regrow deeper. Some trees, against all odds, adapt slowly, quietly, without celebration. They adjust the timing of budburst. They recalibrate their dormancy. They form new relationships with microbes in the soil. Life persists, not as it was, but in a different key. And as the cold retreats, the forest composes something new. It is not the same song. It does not carry the same weight of frost, but it is still alive, still breathing, still listening. The silence that cold once brought has been replaced with a softer, more complex murmur, the rustle of unfamiliar leaves, the buzz of insects that never used to be here, the drip of rain on bark in midwinter. Scientists walk these woods with mixed emotions. They measure carbon fluxes, track tree mortality, model migration patterns. They know what is being lost, but they also witness what is being made. A forest in transition is not a failure. It is a response, and responses can be shaped. By reducing emissions, by protecting peatlands and wetlands, by allowing the forest space to breathe and evolve, we may help guide this transition toward balance. Not a return to the past, but a future where the trees still have a place, even if they no longer remember the cold in quite the same way. And as night falls on this warming woodland, the old spruce still whisper. They creak in the wind, bend gently with the weight of changing air, and cast long shadows across damp soil. Somewhere a bird calls. Somewhere a new seed takes root. The trees that lost the cold have not lost their voice. They are simply learning how to sing in a warmer key. Let us walk deeper into this changing forest, where the trees no longer wait for winter as they once did. Here the maples leaf out early, the birches shed their leaves later, and the evergreens seem to hold their breath, uncertain when to rest, unsure how long to grow. The patterns that once defined their existence have begun to blur. The snowline, once a dependable marker of time, now drifts unpredictably from year to year. And so the trees live not in rhythm, but in adjustment. This adjustment runs beneath the bark, in the tissues that govern how a tree knows what season it is. These inner clocks, once synchronized to temperature, daylight, and moisture, are now confused. A warm spell in midwinter can cause buds to swell too early, only to be killed by a cold snap days later. Or a cool spring might delay growth long past the time when insects and birds depend on it. The mismatch echoes through the ecosystem, from root to canopy, leaf to sky. And it is not only the timing that shifts, it is the energy. Trees must manage the balance of photosynthesis and respiration with care. When the growing season stretches longer, it brings more light, more carbon to fix into sugars, but it also demands more water, more nutrients, more risk. In warmer winters, trees continue to respire, burning stored energy when they should be dormant. The result is exhaustion. A tree may leaf out looking healthy, but its reserves are thin. One more dry season, one more pest outbreak, and it falters. Across the northern forest, this vulnerability spreads quietly. Trees do not fall in unison. They decline subtly, losing a branch, browning at the tips, growing fewer leaves each year. The stress accumulates, invisible until it is irreversible. And in that slow fading, the forest canopy opens. Light pours into places once held in shade. Moss dries. Shrubs explode with new growth. Species that thrive in warmth and disturbance begin to rise. The forest becomes a mosaic, stitched together by climate memory and climate change. In some patch. The cold-adapted trees still hold strong, supported by deep snow and shaded soil. In others, the warmth has already rewritten the script. Fast-growing species dominate, moisture patterns shift, and insect populations boom in the absence of the hard freeze that once kept them in check. Among the most notable are the bark beetles. Their populations, once kept in balance by extreme cold, now flourish year-round. In many parts of Alaska, Canada, and Scandinavia, vast tracts of forest have been affected. The beetles bore into bark, laying eggs and disrupting the flow of water and nutrients. Trees, already weakened by heat and drought, have little defense. Once infested, a tree can die within a season. The silence of cold, which once reset the balance each year, no longer returns with enough strength or certainty. And then come the fires. With warmer, drier conditions and a canopy full of dead or dying wood, wildfires become more frequent, more intense, and more destructive. In many boreal zones, fire was always part of the cycle, cleansing, renewing, making space. But now the interval between fires has shrunk. There is no time for recovery. Seed banks are destroyed, soils lose their carbon. Permafrost, once protected by the insulating forest, thaws in the aftermath, releasing even more greenhouse gases. It becomes a loop. Warmth stresses the trees, stress weakens the forest. Weak forests burn, fires warm the soil. Thawed soil releases carbon. More carbon leads to more warming, and around it goes, with the trees caught in a cycle they did not create. Yet in the midst of this loop, life continues. Shrubs like alder and willow expand, aided by increased nutrients in fire-scorched soils. Grasses flourish in the new light. Birds shift their nesting grounds. Some mammals adapt their diet, their range, their timing. The forest, though transformed, does not stop being a forest. It becomes something new, a different architecture of life, a changed silhouette against the northern sky. And some trees find a way through. They form new relationships below ground. Mycorrhizal fungi, sensitive to temperature and moisture, adapt as well, helping trees access nutrients and water more efficiently. Certain genotypes show surprising resilience, surviving drought or disease better than their neighbors. Seedlings emerge in unexpected places, taking root where fire has cleared the way. Evolution, slow and quiet, is at work. But this evolution requires space and time. If the warming continues too quickly, adaptation may not be fast enough. If the soil dries too often, if the pests spread too far, if the permafrost collapses too deep, the memory of these cold forests could vanish not in a blaze, but in a slow forgetting. The loss of species, of structure, of stories held in wood grain and forest shadow would mark more than a shift in landscape. It would mark a change in identity. Because these trees, shaped by frost, are more than their leaves and roots. They are expressions of a climate that no longer exists. They are testaments to patience, to endurance, to the deep, slow time of snow-covered centuries. Without that cold, they become relics in motion, living archives of another earth. And so the forest begins to scatter its memory. Cones drop seeds, seeds ride the wind, saplings rise in new regions further north, higher up. Assisted migration, humans planting trees in cooler zones, is already underway in some places. It is a gesture of hope, of stewardship, of willingness to help evolution along. Not by forcing it, but by listening to what the trees themselves are trying to do, survive. This is not a story of doom. It is a story of adaptation written in chlorophyll and xylem, in fungal threads and shifting seasons. It is the story of how trees respond not only to climate, but to one another. How a forest, once shaped by frost, now reconfigures itself in warmth, and how, even as the cold fades, the forest continues to breathe. As the sun dips low and casts long shadows through the thinning canopy, the silence between the trees deepens. It is not the silence of winter. It is the silence of decision, the kind that comes when everything is listening. The bark beetle, the seedling, the soil microbe, the carbon itself, all suspended in the quiet moment between what was and what might still be. And in that quiet the trees stand tall, not unchanged but enduring. They have lost the cold, but they have not lost the will to grow. Now let us settle beneath the boughs of this changing forest, where memory clings to bark and transformation rustles in every leaf. The trees that lost the cold are not lost themselves. They are adjusting piece by piece, breath by breath. In their trunks there is the story of a climate that once hummed with winter. In their roots the map of soil and shadow. And in their canopy a question that grows larger each season. What becomes of a forest when the seasons forget? This is not the forgetting time, but the rearranging of it. Snow no longer arrives when it should. Rain falls where frost once settled. Trees once governed by dormancy wake too early, then wait again. The cycles that kept the forest in balance now pull apart, the strands fraying at their seams. And yet still the trees grow, not because they are certain, but because growing is what they know. Within each tree, the process of adaptation unfolds in silence. Some adjust their physiology, shifting the timing of budburst, flowering, seed release. Others rely on their neighbors, drawing strength from the network of roots and fungal threads beneath the soil. These mycorrhizal networks, often called the wood wide web, carry not just nutrients but signals. Warnings of drought, signs of stress, silent encouragement. In a warmer world, these connections may become even more vital. A forest cannot survive alone, it breathes as a whole. But that breath is changing. With each warmer winter, respiration increases. The trees release more carbon dioxide than before. Metabolism speeds. Energy stores diminish faster. This makes them vulnerable to sudden cold snaps, to pests, to dry spells. What was once a time of rest is now a time of effort. The stillness of snow has been replaced by the murmur of rain, the trickle of melt, the soft crackle of bark responding to thermal stress. And in some forests, it is not just a matter of adaptation, it is a matter of choice. Land managers and scientists, faced with declining stands of cold-adapted species, must decide whether to intervene. Should they plant new species better suited to the emerging climate? Should they assist the migration of native trees to cooler regions? Should they let natural succession take its course, even if it means the end of a familiar ecosystem? These are not easy questions. There is no perfect answer. But they are asked with care, with reverence, with an understanding that the future of the forest depends not only on the trees, but on those who walk among them. Some regions have begun experimenting. In Scandinavia, warmer climate pines and hybrid spruce are planted to test their resilience. In Canada, foresters trial species from further south. In Alaska, the line between boreal and temperate forest is already blurring. The seeds of the next forest are being planted now, not just in soil, but in intention. And while some trees move, others remain. Legacy trees, old giants who have weathered storms, fires, plagues, stand as reminders of what once was. Their presence offers continuity, shade, wisdom. Even as the forest around them shifts, they hold a shape in space, a memory in wood. Their rings tell of past droughts, hard winters, abundant springs. And in their presence, younger trees take root, not in imitation, but in response. The forest does not need to return to what it was to hold value. It needs to persist, to shelter, to store carbon, to offer habitat, to sing even if the melody changes. A chorus of birch, poplar, spruce, and pine, some native, some newly arrived, can still carry the essential harmony of forest, interconnectedness, diversity, life. And so the question becomes not how to stop the change, but how to guide it. How to listen to what the forest is telling us, how to notice which species thrive, which falter, how to protect the soil, the moisture, the microbial richness that roots rely upon, how to avoid fragmentation to prevent the isolation that weakens ecosystems, and perhaps most importantly, how to step lightly to be part of the system without overwhelming it. Because we too are trees of a kind, rooted in memory, branching into possibility. Our lives stretch through time, carrying the choices of those before us and shaping the lives that come after. And just as trees stretch toward light, we stretch toward understanding, toward the quiet wisdom of ecosystems that have always known how to adapt, if only given time. In some places, that time grows short. The Arctic treeline, once held steady by centuries of cold, now marches northward. Shrubs become trees, open tundra becomes woodland, animals shift their ranges, permafrost weakens. These are not distant changes. They are here now, arriving faster than most imagined, but they are not irreversible, not yet. The rate of warming, the severity of stress, it can still be softened. We cannot restore the cold entirely, but we can slow its loss. And in that slowing, something remarkable can emerge. A new forest shaped not by what was lost, but by what was preserved, by what we chose to protect, by what we allowed to remain rooted. In this new forest, trees still sway in wind. They still offer homes to birds, shade to moss, memory to soil. Their needles still glitter with dew, their trunks still creak in snow. They may be different in species, in spacing, in voice, but they are still forest, still home. As twilight gathers and the last light slips through a forest in quiet transition, the air is neither warm nor cold, but something between, a space of holding, a breath before sleep. The trees, bathed in this golden hush, do not speak, but they stand, they endure, they grow into what comes next. The cold may have left, but the forest remains. And in its silence there is strength.